Pokemon fans are the Nintendo fans of the Nintendo fandom. I don't really remember the first time I heard that phrase. It might have been something that I said, to be honest. But I do know the context of which it came up as a conclusion in the conversation I was having. You know, back in my heyday, when I used to play goal line defense for Nintendo, in between bootlicks, I'd often find myself in some kind of a disagreement with somebody that's either a PC fan or a Sony fan or Xbox fan even. Everybody just always wanted to make fun of me for being a Nintendo fan, and I didn't understand why. I was having fun. It was my money. I could spend it how I want. The value of $1 for me is not the same as the value of $1 for you. How I enjoy a game is not necessarily how you enjoy a game. Yada, 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 all that fun stuff. The thing is, I used to make those same defenses for Pokemon. I was always a big fan of the franchise. I'd buy pretty much every single game. I don't think that I was necessarily one of the more hardcore fans. I never got into like the online scene. I didn't really like hoarding my Pokemon. I would start every game with a fresh file. I'd go through to the end, put in like, I don't know, 30, 40 hours, and that was good enough. But despite that, I bought every single game up until Sword and Shield. Now, mind you, when I played Sword and Shield, I didn't really think that the graphics were like terrible. Like, I knew they were bad, but I wasn't playing Pokemon for the visuals. I never had, and I didn't think I ever would. But what I do know is that when I finished that game, I was just kind of like done. Like, not just specifically done that game, I was done buying Pokemon games. And the weird thing was, I don't even remember disliking the game. I just remember when I finished, I felt like it was a waste of time. Honestly, I just chalked it down to me just maybe growing out of the franchise. And that still might be the case. But as time went on and I started reading and hearing other people's opinions about these titles, and just how much they feel like they lack any form of substance, any form of passion anymore, I realized that maybe I'm not the only one here. Maybe these games really are just becoming so bland that it's making it hard to connect with them. Now keep in mind, Sword and Shield came out in what, 2019? So it's still been a solid 6 years of me being a pretty hardcore Nintendo fan, up until like the April time frame where I just started losing it. And I found myself being a Nintendo fan but distancing myself from the Pokemon fandom. And it was because I just could not understand how people could see quality in those titles, how they could defend those titles, how they can see them as anything more than just a lazy cash grab. In essence, everything that the entirety of the gaming world has felt about Nintendo, probably through, I'd say, the last 7-ish years, I found myself feeling that way about the Pokemon fandom. And the funny thing is, I wasn't alone. I noticed other Nintendo fans feeling the same way. They would try to distance Nintendo's name and Nintendo's image as much as they can from Game Freak and from the Pokemon Company. When people would criticize Pokemon, they wouldn't defend it. They'd be like, yeah, Pokemon just kind of brings down our image a little bit. Nintendo is not Pokemon. They don't make the Pokemon games. Pokemon makes the Pokemon games. You know, because Nintendo is only 1/3 of the Pokemon Company. Now granted, the 3 parent companies of the Pokemon Company are Game Freak, Nintendo, and Creatures. And it's split pretty evenly between the 3 of those, but Nintendo also has an undisclosed stake in Creatures. So while Nintendo can theoretically not own Pokemon, depending on how big that stake in Creatures is, they still might be the biggest shareholder. And this whole notion that Nintendo and Pokemon need to be considered separate, I think should have been trashed in 2023. Because when Pokemon Scarlet and Violet came out, so many people had created a giant uproar, and they were just really complaining about how terrible it ran on the Nintendo Switch. But it wasn't the Pokemon Company, nor Game Freak, nor Creatures that issued an apology on Twitter acknowledging the disastrous state of their game. It was the Nintendo of America Twitter page taking ownership for their product not running well. Now, despite this, I still think there's a very big difference between games that are developed by Nintendo proper and games that are developed by Game Freak. And likewise, I think the fandoms are very different. Pokemon is easily probably in the top 3 reasons anybody buys a Nintendo console. I'd say Mario, Zelda, and Pikachu are the biggest system sellers on that thing. There's an argument for Animal Crossing if there's a worldwide pandemic, but otherwise, yeah, I'd stick with Mario, Link, and Pikachu. But the size and success of Pokemon is so much larger, and the reach is actually a lot wider than the Nintendo world. Obviously, I got no stats to back this up, but I think that the way people treat Pokemon, and these are the people that are in the greater gaming world, not the ones that are sitting here with you and I talking about gaming all the time. The buyers of Pokemon titles can be compared to the buyers of Call of Duty and FIFA and Madden. These are the ones that will go out there, buy one console, buy the same game for that console, and just make sure they always have the console to play the newest title in that franchise. And they will renew and repurchase every single year. It's bigger than the platform that it sits on. And I mean, you can see it in just how large they are. They are the highest grossing media franchise in the world. They've generated more revenue than any other media franchise in history. $150 billion in lifetime revenue as of 2024. Like, let's put it this way. Today, I told my wife I was going to be working on a Pokemon video. Need I remind you that my name is Nintendine? I make videos about Nintendo, right? My wife is obviously not a gamer. She hasn't picked up a controller in probably 10 years at this point. But even growing up, she wasn't really into video games. She legitimately asked me why I was making a video about Pokemon, like wondering what it had to do with Nintendo. I thought she was joking. I was like, what do you mean? Like, Pokemon is part of Nintendo. It's released on every Nintendo console. What are you talking about? And she started laughing. She didn't realize that. She didn't know it. Now, I could argue that my wife is a very special case of person that really has no idea what's going on in the gaming world. And I was genuinely dumbstruck by her reaction to this. But I think it's very possible that in the whole wide world of people out there that don't play video games, which is obviously an endless amount, there are so many people that know Pikachu, know Pokemon, and don't necessarily equate it with Nintendo. They might not even know there are Pokemon games. They just know there are movies and shows and their kids collect cards and all that stuff. Basically, what this does is it puts Pokemon in a special position where no matter how many people decide that the game is not for them, decide that the franchise is not for them, for every person that walks away, another 100 people will walk in. Another 100 children will feel the wonder of the Pokemon, either because they saw a movie or they watched the show or they got a new Pokemon card. It's not just too big to fail, it's too big to trip, in my opinion. That's not to say that it can't underperform in comparison to the very high standards that Pokemon should have. And when I say perform, I mean sales-wise. I don't mean the crappy quality that they bring out. But even if Pokemon underperformed, like, it wouldn't mean anything. It would going from being the top to being the top. Like, it won't drop off that much. And it's a very big reason why back when everybody was making an uproar and supposedly there was boycotts around the time of Scarlet and Violet, it was so unlikely that anything would come out of it. You have to remember just how many people had a Nintendo Switch and already owned a Nintendo Switch by the time this uproar was happening. There was already like 125 million Switch 2s in circulation. This game came out in November. It was the holiday title for many people. I personally opted to buy Sonic Frontiers instead, and I'm happy with my decision, to be honest. But my point stands. When there are so many Switches out there already, and people love Pokemon, and you're talking about just paying $60 so they can go back and play another Pokemon game, you're in a losing battle at that point. Pun entirely intended. But the reality is the standards for people that play Pokemon games are so low that anything will sell millions, tens of millions. And it's largely because there are a lot of people that have nothing else to compare it to. Or even if they have something to compare it to, it could just be, it's Pokemon and they just want to play Pokemon. Like, here's one comment I saw today. It looks like a 360 game running at high res, and that's a compliment. Another comment. As someone who only plays Pokemon games, this animation is really blowing me away. And look, I can continue on and just find more and more posts like this all over the internet because that's the reality. That's how people feel about Pokemon. They have very low standards compared to what modern games look like. These are mobile titles with mobile visuals for mobile gamers. But they are system sellers, and they are massive system sellers. There has never been a Nintendo console with a mainline Pokemon game on it that sold fewer than 75 million units. You can't make that statement about Mario, about Zelda, or about Smash Brothers or Mario Kart or anything else. Now, obviously, a big part of that is because those consoles are handheld, but when the Pokemon games are released, those consoles fly off the shelves faster than anything else. There is very little reason to believe that if Pokemon had a mainline game on just a strictly home console, none of this hybrid or handheld stuff, it would have any worse success. And I think most gamers realize this, and more specifically, most Nintendo fans realize this as well. I mean, even right now, you have reviews of Pokemon Legends coming in. They're better than Scarlet and Violet, which is a very low bar. The game has a very low budget compared to the amount of money that it rakes in and how much money it's going to be making. So it's very obvious that like the tiniest amount of effort was put into this, because that's the whole Nintendo thing now, is to decrease the cost of the title rather than worry about making it something grand. People are saying they can run around the entirety of the location of the game in 6.5 minutes uninterrupted. because it all takes place in like a single map, right? So like somebody ran around the entire thing and said it took them 6 minutes and like 19 seconds to get around the entire map. That's like around the perimeter of the map. Somebody was running from one end to the other, just a straight line through the middle of the city, and said they did it in 2 minutes. And you'd think with such a small area, now they can focus more on making the assets and the textures look nice, but no, that's dumb. Why would we waste time? That's a salary we have to pay to somebody. Instead, we can just make more money by selling them crap. And you know, it's even funnier because this game has probably worse quality than most $30 titles out there, but they announced DLC before the game even came out that's going to add $30 on top of the already steep $70 price for the Switch 2 version. And that still won't get you full completion because there are some things that are locked behind the Nintendo Switch Online subscription. Because the Switch 2 is the start of Nintendo's gacha generation, and Pokemon is the gacha of the Nintendo world, so it's just gonna get even more intense. Now, in fairness, there is kind of a silver lining here, and it's a comment that I've seen come up quite a few times in my comment sections. With this whole backlash against the Switch 2, a lot of people bring up Scarlet and Violet, the big Pokemon boycott that happened a few years ago, and saying that like, well, that led to nothing. Why would this boycott against the Switch 2 lead to anything? And I think that's a very fair assessment, but there are some differences here. Like I said earlier, I think Pokemon is bigger than anything Nintendo will put out. And when they do eventually release a Switch 2 exclusive game, at that point, I think the Switch 2s are going to be moving way more than any of us can imagine. But the thing is, Pokemon is also releasing on the Switch 1. And there is virtually no difference between the two games outside of the bump in performance and the visuals. Better resolution, better frame rate, which I think most people would agree should come included when you buy a $500 console. But they're charging $10 more for it and virtually nothing else. And if I'm not mistaken, this is not just a Pokemon thing because Metroid is going to be doing it later. So this is not just greed for the Pokemon company, it's greed for Nintendo, which makes sense because they own most of the Pokemon company. So it's consistent with the way that they're going to be operating this generation. I'm only saying this because when other people try to be like, oh, that's just Pokemon company doing that, remind them that Metroid's going to be doing the same thing later. But there is a big difference between the Metroid fandom and the Pokemon fandom. First off, the numbers. Pokemon is way, way, way bigger than Metroid, obviously. It's not even a competition. I would argue that most Metroid fans are fairly hardcore gamers. So realistically, Metroid fans, it's entirely possible that a majority of them are very hardcore Nintendo fans. So they're like, yeah, we're gonna get the new Nintendo console so we can play the best version of Metroid. They have standards. Well, some of them do. The ones that are defending that open world area, not so much. But the Pokemon fans, as we've seen time and again, do not. Oh, they will buy every Pokemon game and say that it's one of the best games made that year, and they will see nothing wrong with anything in the quality. Which is why, even though the Switch 1 version is already reportedly starting to face some crashes, these beautiful, beautiful individuals, these lovely Pokemon fans from all around the world, are going to be more than content to play this game on their Switch 1. These are the same people that bought Scarlet and Violet and had no issues with it. Why would they not buy Pokemon Legends on their original Switch and save $500 for an upscale with better textures when they can't even tell the difference between 4K 1080p and 60 frames per second and 30 frames per second? And that's kind of what I'm banking on here. It might be wishful thinking, it could be completely wrong, but looking at some early pre-order numbers and based off of some of the discussions of people that work in retail around the country, the Switch 1 version is definitely outselling the Switch 2 version. Now, obviously, Switch 2 bundles will take away some of those purchases, but I think the minority of Pokemon fans, those that are actually like hardcore Nintendo fans and play more than just Pokemon, most of them already bought their Switch 2. So I don't really expect massive sales of the Pokemon bundle in the same way that we saw with Mario Kart. This, of course, doesn't include Japan. We'll have to see how that looks next week because there is supply constraints over there, so people will buy whatever Switch 2 they can get. But I'm probably going to make a very separate video on Japan over the course of the next week or so. We'll wait for that. Also, another thing to note, for some of these games that are going to be dual releases, specifically looking at Pokemon and the upcoming Metroid, people that tend to buy these games early on in that first week, first month even of that game's launch, these are obviously like the most hardcore fans, the ones that gotta have things at day one. So they're actually the most realistic enough people to buy the Switch 2 as well. So when you're looking at pre-order comparisons and you're looking at first month comparisons and it looks like that the Switch 2 version might be close to the Switch 1 or might be outselling the Switch 1, keep in mind that's going to be the closest these games get. Over time, the Switch 1 version should take over because there are patient gamers out there that don't want to spend a lot of money on games or on consoles, and the Switch 1 user base is just so much larger. And I highlight this because I think as sales numbers come in around the world, we're going to see just how many Pokemon fans are not interested in buying the Switch 2. especially considering just how available that console is around the world. Again, outside of Japan. And I think it'll be interesting to analyze because you can get a real feel for how many people out there actually feel the need to upgrade to a Nintendo Switch 2 when it doesn't provide much more than what the Switch 1 does. Right, because the argument right now is that the only people really buying the Nintendo Switch 2 are the loyalists, the ones that have to upgrade, have to get it early on. The question of whether or not the Switch 2 succeeds or fails is largely going to depend on the blue ocean, the casual audience, because that's usually what makes up the numbers for Nintendo. And I don't think it gets any more casual than Pokemon, to be honest. And if they're all out there being completely fine with buying the cheaper Switch 1 or sticking with their Switch 1 that they already own, I think it's a good testament to show just how little people care about the upgrade from the Switch 1 to the Switch 2. And I mean, if you look at the leaks, it seems like when Gen 10 does come out, it's going to be on the Switch 2 only, but things are subject to change, and if Pokemon sees that their games are still doing very well selling it on the cheaper hardware, and Pokemon fans are okay with buying even the lowest of quality, I don't know if the Pokemon company will want to take that risk. They might just be like, why would we mess with what we already have and what we know will sell, as opposed to trying to go out there and convince people that our game is worth them spending $500+. I don't know, I guess we'll have to wait and see. But regardless, I think people that are proud and happy with the quality of the Nintendo Switch 2, but at the same time look down at Pokemon fans as if like they just consume any slop that the Pokemon company spits out, I think they might need to do some self-reflection because it is a bit hypocritical. Obviously, this doesn't apply to everybody that's bought a Switch 2, nor does it apply to anybody that thinks that their Switch 2 games look good. But looking at it all at like a macro level, the idea that there are Nintendo fans that try to distance themselves from the Pokemon world because they think that it's just low quality slop and why would people be okay with it, they have to kind of realize the irony of what they've been defending and what they think is good quality versus what the greater gaming industry considers to be good quality. And look, at the end of the day, quality and enjoyment don't often have to correlate, but I think price is a very important part of it. I think quality and price should match to an extent. And when Nintendo is basically trying to lead the industry to a new level of ripping off the customers, yeah, I expect that they should have better quality. Here's a fun one for you. So Dynasty Warriors Origins is coming out in January, right? Yeah, I know, I'm mentioning a third-party game even though they're going to start being very irrelevant in all of the charts starting this month. Between Mario and Pokemon and the upcoming games in November and December, yeah, it's pretty much over for third parties at this point. But still, Dynasty Warriors is going to be coming out. The company that made it mentioned a statement a few weeks ago where they were like, basically, if you don't buy this game, we don't know if we'll remake other ones, so, you know, buy this if you want more, which I already think is scummy enough as it is. But they've also just recently announced that it's going to be a 30 FPS title. And obviously this is not a game that's made by Nintendo, but the 30 frames per second is going to be defended by Nintendo fans, or many Switch 2 fans, I should say. And they're going to talk about how it's entirely acceptable, and I don't know why people are making such a big deal about this, but then in the same breath, they're going to look down at the people that buy Pokemon games. And I hope they understand that the way that they look at Pokemon fans is the same way that everybody else is looking at people that are trying to defend the poor performance of all of these games on the Nintendo Switch 2. And if it's not the poor performance, it's the visuals. If it's not the visuals, it's something else that's just weaker. But I don't know, if you're going to be okay with that, maybe don't try to distance yourself from the Pokemon fans. You're all part of the same family at the end of the day. You are all Nintendo buyers, Nintendo gamers, and have the same standards for gaming. The Nintendo standard. The overpriced and poor quality because it's fun. Right? That's the reason why we buy these things. Also, I thought this was funny, but the Dynasty Warriors dudes, when they released a trailer for the Switch 2, being like, hey, you know, this game's coming to the Switch, get some excitement. Then this was like 2 days ago, mind you, so it's like fairly late on in the Switch 2 version's development, I have to imagine. They decided to use footage from the PlayStation 5 version to like sell the game for the Switch 2. So yeah, add that to the list of scummy things that these guys are doing. Anyway, I got some other stuff related to Pokemon that I want to talk about, but I'm going to save that for another video. This one's kind of already getting up there as it is. Oh, also, my last video I talked about a price drop in France, right? I got a whole lot of comments from people just from all around the world talking about how the Switch 2 has already gone down in price in so many different places too. Europe, Asia, Latin America. So France just might be one of the biggest markets that's doing it right now, I think. But as of this morning, with the release of Pokemon, that same company that initially dropped the price, I'm gonna say it right this time. It's not E. Leclerc, it's E. Leclerc. Mais oui, parlez français un peu. Je m'appelle Nintendine, je suis un garçon. Il fait du soleil. Yeah, I took French through most of elementary school. It was required where I lived. I can't speak much, but I can count to 100. Anyway, the point is, at Leclerc, they actually dropped the price even more now. Remember, they're the ones that kind of started this whole price drop situation in France. They dropped it 30 euros. Everybody else matched, and seemingly, I'm guessing the pre-orders were just not hitting the numbers that they expected, so they're dropping it, once again, down to 455 euros for the bundle. Fitting, I guess, that this is all happening in France, while this game takes place in Lumio City, which is based off of Paris. Oui, oui. Anyway, this is like 20 minutes of talking. I didn't even talk about this game, to be honest. Obviously, I haven't played it. I don't even want to emulate it because it's like clearly not even going to be worth the time I would put into it. Plus, like, I played a little bit of Palworld. I wasn't really feeling that, to be honest. And looking at this game, it kind of reminds me of that, but significantly worse. Although, in Palworld's defense, I think I was just trying to play it for the sake of trying it out. I got to give that game another shot at some point. I just didn't understand why I had to make my Pokeballs. Didn't really make sense to me. I don't know. Anyway, that's besides the point. Speaking of Palworld, actually, famous Nintendo hater, YouTuber, I don't know exactly how to classify this guy, but you know, Fratanga Plays, uploaded a video this morning, and the introduction to it was a rap called Gotta Sue a Mole. His content is very different to mine. I don't know if necessarily it'll overlap with your tastes, but I think the rap at the beginning was kind of funny. But I also have a very poor sense of humor. We'll put it that way. But anyway, that is all I got for today. Thank you so much for listening, and I will catch you on the next one.